Now, as Pierre-François has just emphasised, mastering resiliency is becoming a highly sought-after supply chain and security skill. But what's it like to be tasked with maintaining resilience in today's changing risk environment? And how have our perceptions of resilience evolved as the world and the risks companies face have changed? Well, let's find out now. Norman Heit is Group Corporate Security Director of Vodafone. He joined TAPA EMEA's Supervisory Board in April 2022, shortly after taking up his new post, having been a long-standing member of the association in his former roles, which included as Head of Global Security Management at Boehringer Ingelheim, and earlier in his career, Norman was a liaison officer with the German Federal Police, also representing the agency with NATO. Norman, let me welcome you to the studio. Do come and join us. We're all very much looking forward to your presentation. So when you're ready, I will let you begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share my experiences. First, let me talk about how has our perception of resilience changed. The geopolitical dynamics in the world have changed dramatically over the recent years, and this means businesses and their supply chains face more serious and less predictable risks which occur more frequently and more significantly. If you think back over the last decade, around 2015, and consider the organizational risk matrix that we developed for events related to security that then impact your business, you'd probably be looking at a mixture of something like the following events. And I remember my time whilst I was drafting such matrix that we've had terrorist attack in major cities or close to our sites, something that impacted airports, railway lines, or ports. And I also remember that in 2015, there was a record high number in terrorist attacks within European member states. I think the record high was a peak of 211 terrorist attacks. And that, of course, has risen anxiety and further interest in the topic. You'd probably also have topics like civil unrest or activism on your risk matrix and the impact to your business and how to mitigate that. Other topics such as ransom or cyber attacks. At the time, if you were ahead of the curve and were doing threat intelligence and threat monitoring. And don't forget, this was before Petya was discovered in 2016. Another major incident on that list was network outages or failure of production environment caused by either a malfunction or an accident or something like a natural catastrophe. Oftentimes also scenarios that we practice in our crisis management exercises. And maybe you also had an old pandemic plan at the very bottom of your drawer that was actually collecting and gathering dust. I remember at the time in one of my previous roles, I was also chairing our pandemic group, which at the time was all about collaboration, not yet knowing how important that this may become at some point in time. But you probably wouldn't have considered, in the light of those risk matrices, something like a war in Europe or all of its impacts, a pandemic of the nature we are currently experiencing and still ongoing, lasting over 2 years now, and major natural disasters in Europe, let alone all of these things occurring at the same time. Nevertheless, that's what we have experienced in the last 5 years or so, and as we have seen, polarization between world powers and geopolitical instability has impacted supply chains globally significantly. COVID-19 pandemic transformed further the way we look at manufacturing processes, production across the world, and particularly in China. And there's currently a war in Europe that has led to the tragic loss of tens of thousands of lives and put the continent into something that feels like a state of perma-crisis. We also face an energy crisis on top of that that has made us rethink our assumptions related to the security of supply, and additionally, we're experiencing a cost of living crisis that is affecting all of us. All of these events are happening simultaneously. This change and the fact that we have to prepare and expect multiple major crises going forward to occur not only more frequently, more significantly, and this is all unlikely to pass over anytime soon. And indeed, this change has made developing organizational resilience and operational resilience even more important for managing supply chains and security at large. More disruption means also to our services means that we need to be more resilient in order to maintain the quality of service and the health to our businesses. The events this year in the Ukraine environment have further underlined this change. Let me speak about the Ukraine war and our response in particular. Our response to the war in Ukraine, Vodafone has taken concrete measures to protect not only our network, but also our staff and customers, particularly in our markets bordering Ukraine, but also more widely. In the lead up to the war, we already had heightened monitoring of cyber threats due to rising geopolitical tensions and increased potential for cyber attacks in general. Following that invasion, we have introduced updated security tooling with new indicators and new threat intelligence. We also do active engagement with relevant authorities and have rolled out specific security awareness campaigns to our employees. We also have, of course, supported our partner market in Ukraine with both evacuation of personnel and further help to maintain connectivity during the war. Additionally, our markets, and in particular those bordering Ukraine, have gone an extra length above and beyond in terms of their support for ongoing humanitarian efforts for refugees in the form of free or subsidized connectivity, including roaming, free SIM cards, charging stations, and various donations, and much more. And as you see on this slide here, all of these overlapping crises make a big difference in the terms of how do we deal with crisis preparedness and resilience in general. At the time, it was more frequent the case that an incident occur, you respond either through emergency response plans or through business continuity measures, and then eventually elevated into a crisis management mode or escalated to such. But now with these things overlapping and occurring more simultaneously and more significantly, it becomes more and more of a challenge to security organizations. In terms of the supply chain and the business environment, the war has also prompted a wider review of business continuity preparedness. This is not only driven by cybersecurity or physical security threats, but also due to a highly complex regulatory environment. We have seen numerous of new sanctions, trade controls implemented against Russian companies, but also entities and eventually also individuals. Navigating this regulatory environment carefully was key to maintaining a compliant customer and partner relationship in order to secure our supply chain. This has meant spending significant time and resources to not only double check, but triple check that we know our critical suppliers, not a simple task in a company the size of Vodafone, to be honest, and also to ensure that our supply chain remains operationally resilient, even in the face of continuous changes. That particular area, the resilience of global supply chains, is very likely to continue to evolve even further in the medium term and pose additional challenges for our businesses. Disruption is very difficult to prevent altogether as we continue to live in a connected world with global interdependencies across geographics. It also means we need to build more and better contingency into our supply chains and prepare before we need to respond after external drivers and triggers. Furthermore, the second order consequences of the war, including an increase in fuel prices, food shortages, and price rises globally, are all likely to result in new focuses on what I call traditional security consideration. And that means increase in crime, fraud, civil unrest, and many, many more. And this doesn't exclude the further increase and fragile political environment. And therefore, this requires a targeted threat monitoring and a very well-resourced preparedness organization. These factors will also stress operational concerns for supply chain security professionals, and it means we have to anticipate more delays. It also means we will have to face higher operating costs. It means we have to invest further into ensuring our products get safe and securely from A to B, and it involves very challenging and difficult decisions going forward. In order to address the longer-term challenges proposed by that challenging environmental situation, at Vodafone, we have engaged a very large number of teams across our businesses to work collaboratively on these questions with the intent to be not only more forward-looking in the way we consider crisis management, resilience, and geopolitical security, it also meant that we wanted to early and quickly identify opportunities that arise from the environment. This is very important. That kind of collaboration is very important for the success of all of these efforts. We must collaborate between our own business, and that includes all business functions, and across our markets, collaboration with our international security community, with associations, collaboration with our suppliers, information sharing with the sector and beyond, and close collaboration with governments. This will be the way in which we effectively monitor the challenges caused by the way the war unfolds in Ukraine and by the wider geopolitical tensions that are yet to come. And it will help to further build a stronger defense as we work closely together in order to protect critical national infrastructure and the digital society. Of course, we cannot perform these efforts alone, and we cannot be successful if we remain strongly siloed. As you see on the slide, in a nutshell, this was the response from Vodafone to the Ukraine war, but I also brought a short video that I would like to share with you at that point in time.
Our global corporate security team has led one of the largest crisis responses in Vodafone's history. We have worked to protect our colleagues and their families, to support our partner organisations, provide free connectivity for refugees, and keep our customers in and out of Ukraine connected during the war. Working together with our partner market, Vodafone Ukraine, we have safely evacuated Vodafone Ukraine employees and their families, dealing with the complexities and changing realities on the ground. Vodafone's cyber teams have protected our networks and systems in a heightened risk environment where new threats are constantly emerging. Guided by our legal and Vodafone business teams, we've adapted to a changing legal environment driven by the conflict, reviewing more than 100 regulatory developments, over 1,000 people, and over 80 entities on trade and sanctions watch lists. We provided free connectivity into and out of Ukraine, supporting refugees and their loved ones. An average of 200,000 Ukrainians have roamed on our European network each day since the start of the war. That makes more than 21 million times that Ukrainian users roamed in our European markets. Vodafone customers in Europe have been able to call or text people in Ukraine without charge. Around 70,000 did so each day. More than 7 million calls were made in total. Vodafone foundations, operating companies and Vantage Towers have donated a combined €1.1 million to Ukraine, as well as providing thousands of prepaid SIM cards, connecting homes with gigacubes, establishing temporary Wi-Fi networks and instant charge locations, and more. For now, our work continues.
Welcome back. As you can see on this slide, this represents a short overview of the different work streams we put in place as an immediate response to the war in Ukraine. And as you can see, we were coordinating in total a minimum of 17 different work streams with plenty of decisions and numerous actions taken and also logged from a decision-making perspective. And as I said earlier, it was a key for us to move very early from our immediate response to a more forward, further outlook that then is able to identify also the opportunities that arise from a changing environment. This means we had to collaborate intensively across all functions in Vodafone, setting up different and new projects to make sure we also identify opportunities. This leads to the next slide, which is the supply chain environment within the Ukraine. And as already bespoke, sanctions and controls was probably one of the most underestimated topics at the time. And it quickly became very relevant that it would be a mammoth task for us to go ahead. So over a very short amount of time, a large number of sanctions has been introduced, and the legal and our legal and sanctions team have worked significantly on making sure that Vodafone stays compliant and knows which collaborations and partnerships can go ahead and what would be at stake. With that said, I would like to come to the energy crisis. And one of the issues on everyone's mind currently is the ongoing crisis related to energy and the cost of living, which was of course intensified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We began to focus on the implications of that energy crisis very shortly after the start of the war in Ukraine already. Putting aside the increased cost of the energy and the crisis has combined the far-reaching implications of the geopolitical tensions on the one hand side, driven by the war, with questions around operational resilience within European countries on the other hand side. In other words, the problem statement we were facing, and many other companies are dealing with, is will we have enough power to continue to run our services and businesses this and potentially also next winter? We have done some work over the recent months to understand basically three key areas. First, what is the dependency of different European countries on gas imported from Russia, and what are the implications for the security of electricity supply in each country where we operate? Second, what are the key risk categories that companies in different sectors are exposed and their impacts and likelihoods? And third, what mitigations are available for us to mitigate those risks? Regardless of your industry, if you're operating in Europe these days, then those three areas should help inform how you can manage the supply chain risks connected to your business. Dependency. What did we find out through our exercise? Regarding Europe's dependency on Russian gas, and specifically the portion of that gas which is used to generate electricity, we found that the European countries were actually less exposed than we originally anticipated. Governments across the countries with higher dependency were quickly able to reduce the levels of dependency and therefore increase the resilience of national gas supply across the EU, and it further helped that progress was made on filling our gas storages quickly. The unreasonable warm winter, or fall so far has also helped over the last 6 weeks or so to further ease the strains on somewhat of what the gas supply and also particularly for gas prices currently in order to relieve the current pressure. Of course, risks of electricity outages do still exist, and national power grid companies do remind us quite frequently. But at the image of the current status within Europe's energy security has sharpened in the past weeks and months, it has become increasingly visible that it is relatively unlikely that the security of supply would be impacted. It is much more likely, though, that this winter business impact will further arise from the market prices of electricity rather than their availability. In terms of the risk categories that we have identified, we can basically summarize into 3 areas. One is electricity outage, second is electricity rationing, and third is a direct gas supply rationing or even outage. Let's speak about the first one, electricity outage. The risk of electricity outage is of course the most serious one. We defined this as a fundamental scarcity of electricity where the supply would be far less than the demand and national power grids were unable to provide in order for us to run our networks or services. We also think that this is currently highly unlikely under the circumstances, but we nevertheless have taken action to prepare for the contingency. Second, electricity rationing. Much more likely, in fact, it's already occurring in some of the countries. We consider this as the risk of electricity rationing. We defined as a mismatch between supply and demand that pushes prices up and triggers voluntary reduction measures, as we already see, but it also may prompt mandatory rationing of electricity in some areas. We assess that it will be likely that companies will be asked to further reduce energy consumption wherever possible and to come up with creative ideas to further reduce their consumption. And as a result, we have done a significant amount of business continuity planning and assessment in this regard to understand what measures are available to us to further reduce our consumption with the least impact on our services, the provision, and, if required, additional measures. A direct gas supply disruption is the final one we looked at, and this would mean an outage of Russian gas supply. In this regard, the likelihood was seen to be rather medium, depending on the severity of this upcoming winter season, but also due to the impacts for us specifically as a business, would be so significant from a risk perspective as this is something we're currently not overly worried about. It would mainly affect things like heating in our retail shops and security of supply. This leads me to the last but very important point about government engagement. The bottom line of our findings for this assessment into our resilience in the face of the energy crisis was really that, in addition to preparing the technical mitigations we have available to conserve our energy and reduce our consumption and prepare our systems for potential outages, we need to engage and discuss with governments to raise their awareness about the risks our industry or any industry is faced, especially from our sector, and to work together to avoid the problem in the first place. And this means educating governments about the risks in the case of a rationing scenario. So we have across our footprint engaged with governments together with industry partners, with business associations, and where also possible with further partners and I already said industry associations. Why? because together with a joint approach, we can have a better stance. Okay, this brings me to the conclusion, and I basically want to leave you with 3 thoughts on supply chain resilience today, before we then move on and have some questions. Number 1 is, the world has changed, and businesses and business risk will change with it, and it will do so in a very fast pace. We are also likely to face even more disruptions going further, more frequent disruptions, and I also believe that a solely reactive and siloed approach cannot be good enough anymore going forward. That's number 1. Number 2 is, the war in Ukraine has far-reaching implications, as already bespoke, and the efforts will most likely last for a whole generation. Not only in the region itself, but also due to the regulatory and political impact, as well as second-order consequences, such as the vulnerability of the supply chains. And third will be further issues, such as the cost of living crisis or other disruptive events, which will require us to anticipate, identify, and prepare for even harder and more challenging events going forward. And that will include so-called black swan events, where we try to anticipate what can hurt us the most, even though the likelihood might be very low. Practicing those events will help us to drive resilience, to harden our responses, and to prepare our teams. Thank you so far. Thank you for tuning in and listening. Welcome back.
Norman, thank you so much for that really insightful presentation. I do have a couple of questions before we move on. So maybe we could pick up on some of the points that you were making. How do you try to ensure crisis preparedness?
I would basically divide into 4 things. One is an organizational setup that allows your roles to be clearly identified, to have an understanding about responsibilities, to have processes in place, and well-trained experts in the field that work in an environment which is clearly identified. That's number 1. Second would be around tooling. We can ease ourselves, but in the beginning of a crisis, you always come across something like a chaos phase. Some people refer to it as the headless chicken phase, where everybody's running around, obviously trying to help, try to do the right things, but we can help ourselves with being prepared and sticking to agreed processes, structures, using tools, platforms, not only for the reporting of a crisis incident, but also for the managing of a crisis incident, meaning that there's a decision log prepared, there is guiding principles prepared that people can refer to, so to quickly overcome that chaos phase in the beginning. And then the third one would be training and exercising. So first of all, those roles that are dealing with crisis, not only your crisis management responsibles, but also the point of contacts and other functions or other departments need to be trained for their roles, how to operate, just to give a little bit of sense of confidence in the event of a real crisis. And then, of course, last but not least, exercising crisis events based on predefined scenarios, meaningful considerations about what's important to the business, like I said earlier, what can harm us, and really practice those things. And then the last, 4th point would be collaboration. Share those best practices within your own community, but where possible and where we're allowed to, also with industry peers, with associations, maybe practice together and utilize that during times where we're allowed to.
And we'll talk about collaboration further in a moment, but that's a lot of those 4 channels that you just mentioned. That's quite a lot. Where should somebody that's starting out, an organisation that's starting out, where should they put their absolute priority so it's not so overwhelming, maybe?
In regard to crisis preparedness, yeah. I think it starts with having an organizational setup that allows crisis preparedness. So do you have the organizational capability to basically maneuver through such a thing? So who's providing the training? You need to have these caretakers, somebody, a facilitator, so to speak. So I think it all starts with an organizational preparedness, providing the soil, so to speak, to develop a sophisticated crisis response capability, but also even more important, preparedness.
And turning to operational as well as organisational resilience, in your opinion, what's the difference between those two?
Resilience is a little bit the topic of the hour, it seems. And of course, the Ukraine war has further led governments, national agencies to speak about this more prominently. And I also tried to point that out in my previous remarks. But I believe resilience is such a buzzword currently that not everybody's really clear what it means. And then if you differentiate between operational resilience and organizational resilience, it becomes even more tricky. So my personal opinion is that, first of all, operational resilience aims at processes within your company or within your business and looks at specific processes, specific operations, and tries to build plans and measures to protect those processes and operations. So therefore, I think that operational resilience is one integral part of organizational resilience, whilst organizational resilience aims at a broader picture, basically the entirety of an organization involving all of the functions and everything that can be disruptive. So if you want to be organizational resilient, then you need to not only have business continuity management in place, it's of course one aspect, or information security or supply chain resilience, but you also need to have methods and processes in place that allow you to identify at an early phase a future risk in order to mitigate that timely and quickly before it materializes.
And let's just talk about the supply chain environment a little more specifically. How can resilience within the supply chain environment really be improved?
Well, first of all, I mean, I had my first exposure to supply chain a couple of years ago, where I was supposed to introduce a new program for supply chain in that company. And I would say, first of all, and above all, you have to understand your supply chain. So, and if you cannot understand your supply chain yourself, because maybe you have other responsibilities, you have to find and implement experts that understand the supply chain and its nature. So that is number one. Then I would say, of course, you have to perform your business impact analysis, your risk assessments, your assurance with suppliers, and make sure you collaborate with them. That would be the second I would stress. And the third one is use what's available. Industry, associations like TAPA, best practices, reporting, common exercises, white papers, to make sure you inform yourself well, and also use intelligence that is available that you then again link to your business, hopefully driven by the supply chain security expert. And then last but not least, I would say learn from mistakes. Not only your own, but everything that is available.
And you touched there upon collaboration. Have you got an example of a company where collaboration or a situation where collaboration has really worked well?
Yes, many. Not enough, though. There can never be enough. Some of the examples I would mention is it seems there's an increased interest between the collaboration, especially in the field of cybersecurity-related incidents, where law enforcement agencies or national agencies seem to seek more contact and more collaboration with large companies, especially in the field of critical national infrastructure. So in my previous company, Boehringer Ingelheim, we, for example, conducted joint exercises with law enforcement agencies to make sure where's the handover phase, who is informed by whom, and what does trigger what. So just to, again, limit the friction between the different phases and how you can actually benefit from each other. There's other numerous examples of how this works through associations. Going forward, I think we have a little bit of work to do in a journey going forward with governments and public-private partnerships, as this is a little bit lacking. So I'm a big advocate myself of trying to put these things in place.
And just finally, and I'm slightly asking you to look into a crystal ball here, so perhaps putting you on the spot a bit too much, but you mentioned these black swan events examples that you're preparing for. What sort of future risks, other than the risks and the crises that you've been talking about today, have you got in your mind for the future that we should be anticipating?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't looked into my glass ball this morning. But if you have a well-established enterprise risk management in your company, that again, similar to the organizational resilience, of which this is an integral part of as well, you have to make sure that you anticipate really what hurts your business or could hurt your business the most. That requires an understanding, an organizational understanding, and an understanding for the business and how the company operates, to then really think, okay, what could basically kill us going forward? And then that is a black swan event, even though that might be very, very unlikely. And I personally, I am convinced that by practicing such major black swan and significant events, you learn a lot. Even though if you then encounter something much more, let's say, much less severe or mild, nevertheless, you prepare for the worst, and then you can apply that for even milder scenarios. So I'm a big fan of that. You can also learn from other experiences in other sectors, in other industries, from peers where allowed. So I think you don't always have to basically learn from your own pain.
Norman, thank you so much. A really interesting presentation and update. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the community as well.